Every woman at some point has felt like she's being followed. And when it comes to, let's face it, being manipulated, conned, or even killed, we live in constant fear that maybe we are the next target. As the investigator who has studied victimology and caught the Golden State Killer, what can we actually look out for so that we can make sure that we don't become the next prey?
The reality is that there are men that are out there that want to victimize women. And in essence, a big part of a woman becoming a victim is the situation. The offender is looking for the ability to make that woman a victim at lower risk to himself. The offender is always going to be assessing. So the situation is what the offender is going to be evaluating first. And that is going to be, how can I lure and isolate this potential victim? And do it in a way in which I'm not going to be seen or caught. If you're talking about somebody like, let's say, a Ted Bundy, right? One case is he lures a woman out of a crowd. And he does it in such a way where he's not drawing attention to himself. Well, this is a skill set that offender, Ted Bundy, had. You know, not all the offenders can do that. So the part of the offender's situational assessment is what their skill is. And so, talk Golden State Killer. He was a skilled burglar. So how is he isolating his victims? Within their own homes. He's using the structure of the residence as a way to isolate so he can attack and do what he wants to do. Other offenders, like Ted Bundy, have that gift of gab to put women at ease. And their goal is to isolate, to lure out of a bar. Of course, now some offenders are going to be a little bit more particular about who the victim is, what she looks like. Does that victim remind him of somebody? Serial killer Phil Hughes, for one of his cases that he was convicted of, he went to his wife and said, I have that urge. I need to kill somebody who looks like my ex-girlfriend, Kathy. So the wife starts listing off her coworkers at the bank downtown San Francisco. One of her coworkers becomes Phil's victim. So this particular serial killer had a particular physical need for a victim in terms of how she looked. Many offenders don't have any type of physical trait that they're looking for. They are looking for a victim of opportunity. Again, minimize risk to themselves. Any woman that happened to walk into a particular location at a particular time is going to become that guy's victim. But when you start talking about a woman that's walking, you know, and is there a guy behind me? You know, this is where it really comes down to that whole situational awareness. What is happening today? Everybody's on their phone. They got their headphones in, okay? The offender is assessing that woman going, oh, hold on. I am going to be on top of her before she's even aware. It shifts the advantage to him just from the physical act of now carrying out the crime. Does he have to move her someplace? Is he going to blitz her and attack her right at that location? If you're not aware of your surroundings, that puts the advantage to the offender to be able to carry out an attack. And so having that situational awareness is huge. Keep your head on a swivel. Be aware of your surroundings. The other aspect is also avoid putting yourself in the situations. Be aware that going down that alley looks a lot sketchier than if I stay on this main street and it might take me 10 more minutes to walk around. Take the extra 10 minutes.
Thank you for breaking that down. So I'm trying to get in the head of the killer to know, as a woman, when I'm out and about, how do I protect myself? When I'm in my house, how do I protect myself? If I'm getting coffee at Starbucks, is the person serving me coffee a secret psychopath and trying to trap me and going to kill me eventually?
Right.
Like, I kind of joke about it, but I kind of mean it.
Sure.
So I'm trying to figure out what are those things that they're looking for that can potentially put me as the person they choose.
So environmental criminologists have studied these like serial burglars, you know, and how they can assess a neighborhood and which houses to hit. So with somebody like Golden State Killer, if we have these two houses side by side, one's a 2-story and one's a 1-story. 2-story, bedrooms are upstairs. The only way to get up there is typically through a stairwell. That's the funnel of death. So D'Angelo almost never attacked neighborhoods that had 2-story houses, in part because of that. When you start talking about offenders that are evaluating women out on the street, this is now where the offender is going to be assessing that woman from a personality standpoint. Is she somebody that is going to be compliant, or is she somebody that looks like she's going to fight back or make a lot of noise, right? It's the way you carry yourself. These guys are very in touch with that. If you are somebody that he's assessing, oh, you know, I can grab her and I hit her once and I've got her. She's not going to fight. She's just going to cower. He may choose that type of personality over somebody who's looking confident, looking in shape. Maybe he's seeing, you know, you're in the line with the cashier and you're more boisterous, and it's like, okay, hold on, you know, she could be a problem, you know, from me being able to actually approach her in the parking lot and try to get her into my car. And that's a type of criminal that is out there. So
would they then potentially try and ask you a question like a stranger to see how you would respond, to see whether you're confident or not?
This is an approach that the offenders who have interpersonal skills will adopt. And yes, you know, there is going to be an assessment during that verbal exchange. Maybe there's a simple conversation, you know, oh, my wife's expecting me, you know, ha ha ha, you know, you got any dinner plans tonight with your husband or whatever, you know, if he notices that you have a ring on. And she's going, well, no, you know what, actually, I'm home alone. Now he's going, okay, I now have an opportunity here because nobody's home waiting for her. So I have time. I just need to be able to figure out how to isolate her. And then there's a period of time in which nobody's expecting her. Or she just told me she's going to be home alone. I'm going to go attack her there. You know, so there is that type of intelligence gathering that these offenders will do. But that, again, that type of offender is one that has the interpersonal skills and is one that the woman is not immediately going, something's wrong with this guy. I'm a huge believer in women's intuition. Absolutely. Women have evolved a innate ability to sense this is a bad guy and I need to get away. The hairs on the back of the neck are standing up and beyond what us men have, right? Listen to that intuition. If you just have, no, something's not right about this. This is where, you know, it's My Favorite Murder podcast, Karen and Georgia, fuck politeness is their phrase. This is where it's like, get away from me, you know?
Well, that actually made me think about then, wouldn't that be one of the characteristics that could be to make of an easier victim is someone that is super like empathetic and like vulnerable? Because I can see that if you're a people pleaser, you're not saying fuck politeness. You've been taught you always help out when someone asks for help.
Yes.
So when Ted Bundy comes up to you with an arm in the cast and asks for your help, you're the person that walks with him to his Volkswagen Beetle because you're like, this poor man needs help.
When you start talking about women out in the public space and interacting with strangers, you know, this is where you have to have that elevated just sense of there is a chance that this guy is not who he is pretending to be.
If this episode or any other Women of Impact episode is bringing you value, please smash that subscribe button down below because you have no idea how much that becomes a calling card to all women out there that this is the place, this is the community to be a part of because we've got each other's backs. So smash that subscribe button. Thanks for listening. Now back to the episode. Yeah, growing up in England, hearing about like Fred and Rose West and things like that very much fascinated me of the psychology of how some people can do the most heinous crimes. And so I'd read up a lot about the Green River Killer, Ted Bundy, those two specifically. And I'm in Virginia of all places, in the middle of nowhere, and my husband's at work and had this event, so I'm driving around and I'm out of gas. So I'm filling up my gas tank. This is about 15 years ago. I'm filling it up and I go to pay, and as I'm coming out, this guy says, hey miss, can you help me please? I was like, oh, what's the problem? He goes, can you get in my car and start the engine because I just need to fiddle with... Hair goes right up on the back of my head. I think immediately Ted Bundy's trying to kill me, and I just turn around and run. Now, as I turn around and run, even knowing everything, I'm like, I feel really silly. This poor guy probably needs help. But to your point, I'd rather look stupid than end up being the next victim. But what if I hadn't read the books? What if I didn't know? That politeness in me would be like, yeah, this poor guy needs help.
Absolutely. You know, you did the right thing under that scenario. I'm the type of guy, if I find myself walking on a sidewalk behind a woman and we're like the only ones around, I cross the street, right? Because I want her to know I'm not a threat. If I have car problems and it's like there's this woman I have no idea and I'm going, hey, can you sit in my car? No, this is isolation, right? Mm-hmm. That he is now isolating you inside the vehicle. I mean, some of these guys have these vehicles set up. They have no door handles. Yeah. They're locked. One poor case, Mitzi Sanchez was a young girl abducted. Curtis Dean Anderson was the offender. He abducts her and he has her shackled to a eye bolt that he has installed in the floorboard of the vehicle. So this is where you know, that situational awareness, I'll keep coming back to it. It's like, this isn't right. And then your intuition, the hair was going up because there's something not about this guy. As a guy, I know I can't do that. Men have to be kind of cognizant of how they are interacting with women in that type of scenario. And I think there's so many men that are just completely oblivious that they may be absolutely innocent in terms of what they're doing, but they're putting fear in that woman because she knows there are examples of that exact scenario where a victim has resulted.
It's actually super interesting. We should then be teaching men that as well, because to your point, if a guy's never been in that scenario, if a guy doesn't feel the threat of another man walking, there is a part of me that kind of sees that they wouldn't necessarily think about it. It's like you ask every single woman, what do you do before you leave the house if you're going out at night for dinner? It's very different than if you ask a guy. The woman has to think about, have I got my phone? Is my phone fully charged? Do I have my keys? Do I make sure that I've got a ride home? If not, where's my friend gonna be? Like, we plan to make sure, hopefully a lot of women do, at least I do, we plan to make sure that I have to be safe, so I have to think of all these things, but I don't think a guy does. Okay, so in your book, I've pulled out a few other things that you talk about in regards to women. So you talk about victim vulnerability. It's a technique that you describe that Golden State Killer specifically used to make the victim even more vulnerable. And you explain that he goes in and like gets her like wallet and to find out her name and then starts calling her by her name. Talk to me about what that actually is doing and what you think he was trying to do.
So Joseph DeAngelo, during the East Area Rapist phase, while he's got them bound and immobilized, that's when he goes immobilized. That's when he goes through the house, and that's when he would find the woman's purse and he would look at the driver's license. But by calling her the name, this is where we get into when you start talking about victim vulnerability. But this is also part of that psychological sadism, because he knows that when he now calls that victim the name, she's immediately thinking, he knows me. How does he know me? Where does he know me from? Right? And this is in part, he enjoys instilling that fear. I mean, there's a level of control now that he is putting over this victim. And he didn't just use names to do this. In one instance, the woman was a water skier, and he ended up telling her, I've seen you at the lake. And she had just gone to a lake to water ski. And then it turns out, well, there was a boat on the driveway in front of the house. And so he probably just bluffed, knowing, well, okay, got a boat, it's set up for, being out in the lake. I've seen you out in the lake. So now it's putting in her mind, he has been following me. I will tell you that that woman, who I knew very well during my investigation, she called me almost daily in the morning and severely traumatized from her attack. After he had pled to his charges, this victim confronted him in court with her impact statement, and she brings up him saying, "Saw you at the lake." And she goes, "I had a true love to water ski, and I could never water ski again after that." So, and then one victim after another with other similar types of impacts on their life that DeAngelo did to them, but it doesn't heal them. And I think that that's where, those types of impacts, calling the victim by her name, "I've seen you at the lake," those little things, that in many ways is psychologically putting the knife in and twisting it a little bit.
Do you mind if I ask you why you got so emotional just now with that story?
It's one of those, I get emotional a lot now when I talk about my cases and my victims. There are certain things I can't talk about without choking up. I mean, she was sexually assaulted. Her marriage dissolved as a result because her husband was also a victim in this particular case. Massive impacts and massive trauma in her life. I think there's a lot of buried emotions inside of me from all these cases that I've worked, right? And when I end up talking about certain things, it might bubble up, So,
I mean, this is a place to be safe, and the amount of work that you've done to help these women. You talk about this in your book. You were married, and it was, you were neglecting your wife, also that you could really help these women find the perpetrator. I mean, you tell a story about the woman who was attacked, and then 24 years later, he then calls her up.
Yeah.
And what does he say to her on the phone?
"Remember when we played?" And you have to recognize, I mean, it was 24 years later. She had remarried, so her name was different. She had moved all the way across town from where she had been attacked. Yet within 24 hours of a newspaper article coming out, he had her phone number and is calling her. So he kept track of her. He probably kept track of some of his other victims. I know one victim, 5 years after she was attacked, she's at work at a Denny's, and he calls her there. And I believe he was a customer and saw one of his victims and probably walked across the street to a gas station payphone and called up the victim, just strictly to instill fear.
God, that's heartbreaking. Is there anything that you suggest we shouldn't do if we fear that our life is at stake?
If the offender is trying to move you, you do everything you can to prevent that from happening, because what's going to happen at the second location is far worse than what he's going to do to you there. So like I talk to my kids, and if somebody's trying to grab them, and they're older now, but when they were younger, I don't care if they have a gun, I don't care if they have a knife. You do not let them get you into a vehicle or to a second location, because then that's when the horrors actually start.
So what is happening? Is it then the fear where you're like, okay, let me just do what they say because then I'll be okay? And that's actually the opposite of what we should do?
Yes, but under a different scenario, Golden State Killer, some of these men whose wives were raped while they were bound, they're very traumatized and they feel that they had let their wives down, And I've had to talk to some of these men and say, well, if you had tried to get up and go after him, you would be dead and she would be dead, because that's what DeAngelo did. There was one man down in Southern California, out in Santa Barbara, who had undone his bindings. And when DeAngelo came back into the room, he tried to get up. As soon as he pushed up out of the bed, he caught a bullet through the neck. And then he continued to try to run around at DeAngelo, and DeAngelo tracked him and killed him, and then goes over and does a contact gunshot to the top of the female victim's head. So there's a scenario there where the men who complied with DeAngelo up in Northern California, they in essence probably saved their life and their wife or girlfriend's life, and possibly even the kid's life if they had kids in the house. But I do think that if you are now in the process of being attacked, whether it's with the purpose of getting you into a vehicle or moving you to a second location, or somebody is attacking you, you have to fight, and you fight for your life. The one tactic is, let's say this guy is just absolutely overpowering you. There's nothing, you're realizing there's nothing you can do. And he seems to be amping up during the fight. Try going limp. In case this guy is a sexual sadist. So, several examples I'll give. I have a woman, 1969, she was hitchhiking in Berkeley. Guy picks her up, and next thing she knows, he's not following her direction. He takes her up into the hills and ends up raping her in the front of his car. And she remembers looking out at the trees and the sun, the sunlight coming through the leaves, and she's going, "These are my last moments." And she goes, "I just felt a peace." And I started stroking his neck, the back of his neck, just like in it, like a consensual type of, affectionate type of way. And he just went, boom, pushed up off of her and looked at her weird, stopped the sexual assault, drove her back to Berkeley.
Oh, I did not expect that to be the outcome.
There's a case example up out of the Pacific Northwest where a sex worker is pulled into the dark parking lot area, and the guy is on top of her, and he's taking a knife and is literally just carving her up, right? She's fighting. He's just getting more and more excited, and she goes, "I'm dead," and she goes limp. He gets up and he walks away because the sexual sadist is there to perform the sadistic acts and get that fear, the scream, the infliction of pain. And when you go limp, that they no longer are getting what they have fantasized about. But the problem is that if the guy doesn't stop, then you need to re-engage and fight for your life again. That's just the reality of it. And there are most certainly women that are capable of physically fending off a man that's attacking them. But there is going to be the scenario where the man is just so much more powerful and possibly even skilled at various types of fighting. If this is a petite woman and she just physically can't do it, this is where you're gouging eyes, you're doing whatever you can. There's no holds barred when you're fighting for your life against that. But you have to avoid getting into that isolated situation with a guy that you're going, there's just no way.
But I think that's where, as a woman, I would just think about the psychology behind it, right? It's like, okay, if he's trying to overpower me, do I give over? But then sometimes, if that's their purpose, then they actually sometimes, some cases where the person gets more angry because the woman's actually relinquished, and what they actually want is the fight.
And there are, so as an example, I mentioned in our first conversation, gross rapist typologies. Your power reassurance, the guy that likes to stroke your hair while laying next to you in bed, the rapist. This is the guy that if you fight back, chances are he's going to run off. That he is not that dominant personality, typically. And so one of the cases that I was involved with is this NorCal rapist. After close to 20 years of very sporadic attacks spaced out, but he was that power reassurance type rapist. And there are times when women fought him and he ran off. D'Angelo was, as East Area rapist, I would call him more power assertive. He's dominant. You fight him, and women would fight him, and he would just start punching you in the face and to gain compliance. So you do have to do some assessment. But when I am saying you fight for your life, it is no second location. And, if this guy is just all of a sudden being very violent with you, and it's like, this guy's just going to keep going, he's probably wanting to kill me, yeah, you have to fight for your life.
Yeah, amen to that. So you've mentioned, and you talk about in your book, that most likely a lot of people he chose were people that pissed him off.
My theory is that, yeah, some of these men pissed him off in some way, whether it be interactions just out in the world, whether they had verbal altercations. That's one of the big questions in the case. When Sacramento Sheriff's Office was dealing with this East Area rapist, they decided to reach out to the communities because people were in an uproar. So they had these town hall meetings, which were typically in high school gymnasiums. And the original investigator on the case, Carol Daly from Sac Sheriff, would often lead these town hall meetings to update the neighborhoods as to what they should do to keep themselves safe, as well as what the law enforcement is trying to do to catch the guy. And at one point, this Italian male had stood up and started lambasting some of these other men who had allowed their wives to be sexually assaulted by this rapist. And later on, that Italian male and his wife became victims. So if that is truly how that happened, that suggests that D'Angelo was in that audience and this man stands up and challenges him and he's like, I will show you. And so he chose that couple based on who the man is. And I do believe that some of these couples were chosen because of the man and not the woman. So that's showing that vindictive aspect. In fact, the very first case with a male present, the interesting aspect about that attack was the sexual assault on the woman, where D'Angelo's sexual assault, and I won't go into details, but generally were relatively generic, if I can use that term. But in this particular case, he's putting high heels on the woman. He's making her straddle him up on the sofa. It's like he's living out a consensual fantasy with her. And so that's where you go, okay, no, he's not necessarily pissed at her. He's been fantasizing about her, and now he's living out that fantasy. And he's also now exerting his dominance over a man after the newspaper article that had come out saying, well, he never attacks when a man's present. Well, he's going, well, I'll attack with a man present, show you I can do that, and I'm gonna have sex with this woman that I've been fantasizing about.
I think that's really part of a false sense of safety, because I think I would have thought that too. It's like, oh, he's not going to do it if a guy's around, or if I've got an alarm present, but he would like go and cut the phone cords, and like he was very deliberate. Right?
Oh, well, and this is where D'Angelo is such a dangerous predator, because from 1974 up until 1979, he was a full-time law enforcement officer, initially starting out in Exeter, California, next to Visalia, and then he moves up to and becomes a cop in Auburn while he's committing sexual assaults all over Northern California. So he's a full-time officer. Then he gets fired for shoplifting, and after he's fired, that's when he's down in Southern California and bludgeoning either single females or couples to death. And that's just part of that. He's angry now that he's been stripped of his law enforcement authorities, and he's now taking that out on the victims down here.
Did he have access to the criminal reports?
Well, he most certainly had access to what's going on. I mean, he was part of the anti-burglary task force.
Jeez.
I mean, he gets sent to a burglary investigation school while he's the Visalia ransacker committing burglaries. Us taxpayers paid for him to get training to become a better predator.
Yeah. You're so right.
Yeah.
So also, was he then hearing how they were investigating the burglary? So he's like, oh, they just mentioned that. I've got to make sure next time that I don't do that.
There's no question about that. There was a composite that was put out. Turns out that composite was pretty much spot on to what he looked like at the time. He was heavier. Facial characteristics were right on that composite. When he moves up to Sacramento, he loses a bunch of weight. He becomes very athletic looking and trim. Now he makes sure he always has a ski mask on. He's shining flashlights in his victims' eyes when they wake up in the middle of the night in their bedroom, so they're completely blinded. And he's doing all of this to prevent victims from seeing his face, but he's still telling these victims, don't look at me or I'll kill you. Because he knows there's a composite of him down in Visalia that looks just like him. So he's now implementing different techniques in order to be able to keep offending without making the same mistake.
It's so, I don't want to say genius is a compliment, but it's freaking genius. And I saw an interview with you before you caught him, and you were even saying people think that maybe it's the same person, but I don't think so, because I was reading reports, and a couple of people have said that he's really chubby.
Yeah.
And over here, people are saying that he's super fit. So I actually don't think it's the same person. So it's crazy to hear you say that. And obviously that was part of the whole manipulation.
No, for sure. When I assess, kind of, think back about what I predicted about the case when it was an unsolved case, that's one of the things where I was like, oh, I was wrong. The physical descriptions being so dramatically different within 6 months time, I was like, I don't think this is the guy.
Yeah, I mean, look, it makes complete sense. Within 6 months, you got people over here saying he's heavy set, people over here saying that he's really fit. You would assume that he's the different person. And that's why I wanted to bring it up, because that's the level of trickery and manipulation and extent that he was willing to go to trap people, abuse them, and then get away with it.
No, absolutely. When I talked with his ex-fiancée, Bonnie, and I had a picture of him in 1979 in police uniform, very lean looking. And Bonnie was like, I never saw Joe like that. He was always heavy. He purposely lost weight. And it was, the description as Visalia Ransacker wasn't he was just heavy set. It was, he is fat through the hips, fat thigh, big fat calves. You know, there's aspects, there's physical descriptions. There's two different, there was an officer and an anthropology student that gave these descriptions. And I'm thinking about it, you know, like part of it is guys don't lose weight in their calves. We don't put weight on in our calves, right? That's not a place. And I was like, big calves. And East Area Rapist, when he shows up and he's nude from the waist down for 2 of the first 3 attacks that he commits in Sacramento, so the victims see his entire physique, and they're athletic, trim. You know, it was like way dramatically different. Well, I was wrong. He did.
Yeah, I get what you mean.
Yeah.
I mean, that level, though, of sophistication. So when I keep going back to how do we women get trapped? Where are all the places where we don't see it coming? We end up being the victim. How do we help women, whether it's from emotional manipulation, emotional abuse, to physical, to all the way to the things that you deal with, which is, you know, insane, heartbreaking, serial killer, women are actually dying. I just think, okay, in all that spectrum, what are the things that we're missing? What are the things that we don't realize?
These predators are out there, and they will hunt you. And if they've locked in on you, then they are going to try to find a way to make you a victim. It's awareness that these guys exist. That's probably the biggest thing to know about, because if you're aware that there are guys that are going to hunt you, whether you're in your house or you're out shopping or you're hiking at Yosemite or whatever, there are guys that are out to get you. I think then women will probably pay closer attention to their surroundings. They'll pay closer attention to their personal security, whether it be at home or walking from the mall out to the car or at work. You know, that's probably the biggest message. Going back to situational awareness, the biggest message is just be aware. You know, these types of guys exist. And all you can do is take steps to make it harder for them to decide that they can make you a victim.
So one of the things you actually talk about also for victims is the low risk of detection. Now, there's a quote I pulled of yours. If I ever want to kill someone, I'll do it in LA and make it look like an OD with a suicide note nearby. So easy.
Well, that's based off of a real case. And I don't want to disparage, LA authorities or anything, but I had a case, and this man is found bludgeoned to death in his home in my jurisdiction. And his son is a suspect, and son just disappeared. Well, son is found in Santa Monica, and he's committed suicide. He basically filled up a bathtub in a hotel room and literally just carved up his forearms and his neck. Just brutal. And laid down and bled out in the tub and had written a suicide note. And I have no question that it's suicide. But I go to LA coroners to view his body with a couple of the homicide investigators on the case. And, LA coroners is just a world unto itself. It's just massive, right? And there's bodies that are rolled in plastic and at the ends have been tied off with rope, and they're stacked on top of each other. So they pull the son's body out and goes into a room. And so I'm expecting, he would have been completely autopsied, and this is where, Y-shaped incision, all the internal organs removed, brain is removed, it'd be very obvious that he had been gone through an autopsy. Open up the plastic, and it's like, he hasn't been autopsied. All they did was do a liver biopsy for tox. And that's when I was just like, oh my God, it'd be so easy to stage a homicide, make it look like a suicide. And the authorities, they have so many dead bodies they're dealing with that they would dismiss that without digging in further. In some ways, by taking advantage of volume, you can hide criminal acts.
When you're looking then at this, whether it's a body or a crime scene, does all the information tell you about the predator, or does the information tell you more about the victim that then leads you to the predator?
It's both. You have to look at the crime from really three vantage points. The victim, the offender, and the environment, the scene. And there are, when we get into the serial predator, there are, you've heard the term MO versus signature, right? So
actually, what is the difference?
Okay, so the MO is what the offender has to do to accomplish the crime, versus a signature is a behavior the offender does for his own personal gratification. It's part of his fantasy. Maybe the offender has tied a very intricate knot. Well, that's part of his fantasy. He didn't have to do that. He could have just done a very simple knot. Well, there's an MO aspect to that because that's how he can control the victims. So when you are starting to assess the offender's actions, okay, it's like, well, how did he get here? How did he get into this location? What is he doing while he's inside the residence or wherever the crime scene is at? What are his interactions with the victim? And then now looking at the wounds, looking at the state of dress, the clothing, blood patterns in the scene, kind of reconstructing the actions that the offender is doing. But then there's also having to relive the victim's perspective. What is she doing when he's on top of her? How is she fighting? How is she fighting back? Where can I find his DNA? There's one case, had a woman inside, it was like a trailer, and she had put up a huge fight, and ultimately she was bludgeoned to death. But you could just tell this offender struggled to get her under control. Blood all over the place, blood smears, and her sock on her foot had been ripped, and so her foot was exposed. And you start thinking about her fighting and everything else. What is she doing? Well, she's also kicking, right? And talking to the criminalist that was going to process her body at the morgue. It was like, make sure you swab the bottom of her foot. Well, that's where we got the killer's DNA.
Oh my God, it was at the bottom of her foot.
Yeah, and so this is where, really reconstructing from all perspectives can give you either locations of evidence or gives you insight as to, who the offender might be to the victim. Is this a complete stranger? Is this a fantasy-motivated crime? Is this somebody that knew the victim? I've got cases where, the victim, after she's been killed, is covered. And that's usually an indicator that either the offender is either having remorse because he has a connection to the victim and can't deal with what he's done to the victim, or is not able to stomach looking at what death looks like, right? But typically, if an offender covers the victim, that is usually a huge behavioral indicator that, the offender might be somebody close to the victim.
Are there any other signs that you would see to see whether they're close or strangers?
When you get into when they start staging, so this is where now they're trying to make the crime look like something it's not. And in the one case in which the victim is covered, he had in the victim's blood written victim number 1 on the kitchen wall above where she had been stabbed to death. So it's like, okay, he's trying to tell people walking into the crime scene, I'm this badass serial killer, this is my first victim and I'm going to continue, right? That's the message. Yet he's covering the victim, but then he had put a lit candle underneath a chair in order to catch the chair on fire to burn the place down. Well, why are you writing a message in the victim's blood, but then also wanting to burn the place down? It's called contradiction. This is when you step back and go, this is a staged crime scene. The offender doesn't know what he wants to do. And why is he staging the crime scene? Because in his mind, he knows he's logically going to be a suspect. he has a connection to the victim. Versus, let's say you have a true predator who's an absolute stranger to the victim. His biggest concerns are leaving identifying evidence, DNA or fingerprints. If he doesn't leave those, trying to solve that case, it becomes a monstrous task because it's very hard to identify somebody that has no connection to the victim whatsoever.
In that case where the person wrote victim number 1, was it someone that she knew?
Yeah, it was a friend of hers. He had been to her apartment multiple times. In fact, we got his thumbprint impressed in the side of the candle.
Oh my God, really?
Yeah.
Oh God.
Right? You know, and he had sexually assaulted her.
Wow.
So, you know, this is where, you know, you can interpret the crime scene and start to get an understanding of who the offender might be. It doesn't say, oh, it's Dean,
Right.
you know, but it's like, it's somebody that knew the victim. Versus if I see something where I'm seeing fantasy. I've got another case in which the woman who's found nude from the waist down behind a motel, she had 8 bras put on her, and she had numerous stab wounds to upper right part of her back, but none of them went deeper than an inch. And they all had hemorrhaging in the margin, showing that she was alive when those stab wounds were happening. Well, that's a sexual sadist. What he's doing is called pickerism. That's taking a knife, screwdriver, ice pick, and the psychologists say it's penile substitution. He is going in and out of the woman's body with the weapon. But he's doing it in a kind of a torturous way while she's still alive. He's getting sexual gratification. But when I see this, I'm going, that's fantasy. This is a predator. She probably has no relationship to the guy that did this to her.
Wow. So how do you know then what ends up being a crime of circumstance versus a premeditated, planned out crime? What I mean by that is, let's take this woman's case. In what you just described, okay, was it that her and her friend were hanging out and he then tried to make a move and she said no, he felt really embarrassed, he enforced it, she pushed back, and then it ended up being a murder, and then he was like, oh crap, I have to cover it up? Or they're a psychopath and they actually are like, I'm going to kill this person?
So in this particular case, the victim number 1 case, I think what you just talked about, they're hanging out and then maybe she didn't want to have sex and he forced the issue and got upset and killed her, and now he's scrambling. That's probably what happened. He never made any statements. If I'm assessing a case, signs of premeditation do exist. And sometimes it's going to be very obvious, and sometimes it won't be obvious. And you can't tell, was this a spontaneous crime or was this something in which the offender had planned? So as an example, the Golden State Killer, Joseph DeAngelo, would often, during the East Area Rapist phase, show up with shoelaces and then toss the bindings to the woman to make her bind her husband up, and then he'd go and bind the woman up. Okay, he's planned this ahead of time. Versus offenders go into a house and end up using the drapery cords or whatever's inside the victim's house as binding material. Now, he may have planned the crime, but he also knows through experience, I can go into any house and I can find a knife, I can find binding material. I don't need to bring anything with me. I just need to get inside. You know, so that's where it becomes less obvious, you know, is it pre-planned or not?
So when you look at cold cases, you're looking at who did it, right? And so when you're looking at it, how much of the psychology are you thinking through, and whether they are a psychopath, a sociopath, or someone that is just very smart? Like, for instance, you mentioned earlier, if someone knows them, they're more likely to put something over their face.
Right.
I assume a psychopath has 0 emotions. So if they knew the person, would they still put a jacket over their face? Or because they're a psychopath, they actually don't give a shit?
When I'm assessing the behavioral, the psychological aspects of the crime scene, whether or not somebody is a psychopath doesn't help me in my investigation.
Really? It doesn't help at all?
We don't have a database of psychopaths that I can search.
Yeah.
You know, my goal is to find things that can narrow the suspect pool. And, you know, part of that, let's say if I'm looking at like the woman with all these stab wounds. That's picarism. I'm going, well, that is a sexual sadist. I have a woman that was killed 6 years later, and the knife has been used in a very sadistic way. This is the same type of offender. I can't say it's the same guy, but I need to consider, oh, hold on. Sexual sadist, 6 years apart, same area, actually same town. Could it be the same guy? Well, that helps aid the investigation from like a practitioner's use of the behavioral assessment. From there, it's like, well, I've got DNA in this case. I don't have DNA in this case. So maybe this DNA, once this case gets solved, is going to solve this case because I got the same types of behaviors being expressed. The goal is always to try to utilize physical evidence, behavioral aspects, investigative information, witness statement to narrow the suspect pool, because then I can focus my resources on a smaller group of potential suspects to see if something can be used to solve the case. It's always the goal, is to try to get that suspect pool narrowed down investigatively.
In talking about the victim, have you ever seen a scenario where, specifically with the Golden State Killer, did any of those relationships actually survive?
Yes.
Really?
Absolutely. So some relationships, of course, did not. So husband, wife, divorce for sure, or boyfriend, girlfriend, split up. But I will tell you, I personally know there are several couples that are still married and they're still living in the house that they were attacked in. At which you go, how could you do that? But they can, and it's worked for them.
I mean, good for them. I think whatever works for that person. So I spoke to my husband after I read your book and after I was diving into your world, and I said, babe, like, these cases are really keeping me up at night. Like, it's just so horrifying that what a human can do. And so I was like, I'm the person that I want to know the knowledge, even if it's hard to hear, so that I can always have a plan. I never want to be a victim of circumstance. And so I said to him, what would we do? Like, I was like, what would you do if you were on the floor and you were bound and there were plates on your back? And he looks me dead in the eyes. He's like, I would never get to that point. And I was like, well, what would you do? And he's like, I wouldn't let them bind me. Like, once I'm bound, I'm fucked. And I'm like, but what would you do? And he's like, I would rather them kill me.
Yeah. Well, my wife and I had similar conversations during the investigation. And the best thing in this scenario is you split up.
Oh, is that the best thing to do?
In essence, if there's a guy standing in my bedroom with a gun, I go after him and she runs out at the same time. And with somebody like D'Angelo, many of the men today that had their wives or girlfriends raped while they were bound, they feel that they let her down. And they're very, these men are crying in front of me. They're very traumatized to this day. But I told them, you probably saved your and her life because you didn't go after him. But I know in talking with my wife, it was like, you know what, you just don't let him die. You may die, but you can't let him get to where you are bound.
Is there anything else that you want to say, lastly, to any women out there who may want to just protect themselves and not become the next victim?
Well, I just want to reemphasize, be aware. You have to be aware that these types of guys are out there. They are seeking you out, and just amp up your ability to protect yourself, whether that's just situational awareness aspects, whether that's personal security, and make sure that you always have your head on a swivel when you're out and about.
Thank you, Paul. Where can people find you and your amazing book, Unmasked, and your podcast that you've got?
Sure. So I'm not a big social media person, but I got the Twitter, X now, at Paul Holes. I have Instagram, at paul.holes. It has the blue check mark. Make sure you look for that. Of course, if people want to know more about me, this book turned into a memoir. And I not only talk Golden State Killer, but other cases, as well as the impact working this type of career has had on me in my life. I have 2 podcasts right now, Small Town Dicks with Yardley Smith, the voice of Lisa Simpson, her husband Dan, and his twin brother Dave, who are both cops. And I've got Buried Bones with Kate Winkler-Dawson, where we talk historic crimes. And you find out that crimes committed 200 years ago, well, they were committed for the same reason why people commit crimes today. I'm currently still helping law enforcement with their unsolved cases.
Guys, you've got to go check out his book, Unmasked. It is fantastic. It is so full of tips and tactics and then stories and then just the real heartfelt storytelling of what Paul has gone through in order to solve these crimes is incredible. And there's so many lessons that you guys can check out. Guys, honestly, the reason why I started this show is to help women. The reason why I choose the guests that I do is to help women. Please do share this video. Tell your friends, tell your family. We cannot do this alone. We are here to help each other, guys. So go spread the word. If you're not following me, follow me at Lisa Bilyeu. If you're not subscribed, click that subscribe button down there. And until next time, guys, be the hero of your own life. Peace. If you enjoyed that, then make sure that you click right here, right now.
Everybody around a sociopath or a narcissist is a pawn, is a tool for that person to get exactly what they want. They will play the victim like nobody's business. They blend into the environment.